We'll go ahead and get started. I'm Frank Williams, Brunswick County Commissioner, and this is the Commissioner Frank Williams Leadership Forum. The way these events started, a few years ago, I was having what I called a District 5 Leadership Forum, and they were in-person events held in my part of the county, which is the northern part, District 5. And the purpose was to bring in speakers or give residents of that area access to information they might not otherwise hear. Obviously, with COVID, we haven't been able to do the in-person events, but it's opened up some opportunities because I've been able to have out of town speakers who live in Raleigh or other places, but could still participate in this event. And so I rebranded it from District 5 to just the Commissioner Frank Williams event because it's now not only countywide, but beyond the borders of Brunswick County. We've had two of these virtually in the past 3 months. The first one was an election analysis right after the election, and we had a couple of political consultants on that. The next one was a legislative preview. And for that one, we had Tom Fetzer, former Raleigh mayor and a lobbyist who now lives in Wilmington, Greg Thompson from the National Federation of Independent Business, and Amber Harris from the Association of County Commissioners. Both of those are able to be viewed in their entirety on my website for anyone who is interested, and that is commissionerfrankwilliams.com. Today's discussion is an economic forecast, and that's certainly something that's typically on everyone's minds at the beginning of a new year. I've seen 4 or 5 of these events happening in different areas that I could participate in the next 3 weeks. But I think with COVID last year and the election and yesterday's election and what's going on in Washington, that this is an even more interesting topic now because there are so many additional variables that can impact what the economy is going to look like. Today's panelists are to speak about the national economy, Dr. Thomas Simpson, who is an executive in residence of economics at UNC Wilmington, and Dr. Adam Jones, associate professor of economics, regional economist, and department chair of economics and finance, also at UNC Wilmington. And he's going to speak about the local economy. And I believe you guys said that you wanted Dr. Simpson to go first and talk about national, and then you'd follow that up, correct, Dr. Jones? So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Simpson. And as he gets started, anyone who has questions, you can post those in the chat window or use the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those at the appropriate time.
Okay, well, I hope everyone is able to see the slides. It's unfortunate we can't get together face to face, as Adam and I did this a couple of years ago, and it was a very enjoyable time. We had a very lively question and answer session. It was a lot of fun, and I'm sure this will be fun as well, but it would be even more fun if we could all be together. And all of this is related to COVID, and just like just about everything else that has been happening over recent months. And so I wanted to look at the national economy in light of the COVID shock and what's been happening since that time, and get some sense in terms of where we're headed. So without any further delay, the shock that we experienced last spring is the biggest negative shock that our economy has faced on record. Just to get the timing straight here, evidence that COVID was becoming a problem was growing over the first couple of months of the year. And by the time we got into March, it became clear that this was a serious problem that was facing the country, was facing the economy. And by mid-March, we were going into essentially a national lockdown. So March is in the first quarter. Economic activity almost ground to a halt in March. And as you can see, these are quarterly changes, percent changes in real GDP, total output in the economy. So there was a contraction in the first quarter. It was muted somewhat because it happened at the end of the quarter. And when you're doing quarterly average arithmetic, it's not going to show up as a big decline, but you see a 1.25% decline. The big decline in terms of quarterly GDP came in the second quarter, that the economy contracted. We think that the contraction kind of came to an end, that things started to turn around sometime in April or the beginning of May. But in terms of the quarterly averaging arithmetic, it shows up as a big decline in the second quarter, even though we were recovering. Now, again, keep in mind that these are quarterly changes. You're probably familiar with the annualized changes, and I try to, with an event like this, I try to stay away from them because doing the compounding gets kind of complicated, and going from quarterly to annual is a little more complicated than usual. But by the time we got to the third quarter, things were steadily on the rebound. And as you can see, the growth in the third quarter, we're looking at the middle column here in this chart, was 7.5%. That erased roughly 3/4 of the decline that occurred over the first half of the year. So pretty sharp rebound. I think as we look at this in retrospect, it looks like this has been pretty much a V-shaped economic cycle, although we're not out of the woods yet, as I'm sure all of you know and we'll be talking about. So I've penciled in, we don't have a number for the fourth quarter yet. I've penciled in a 2% increase on top of the 7.5% increase in the third quarter. This is roughly in line with a number of forecasts, particularly the one coming out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, which a lot of people utilize. So if we take a look at what that means over the year, that means that economic activity contracted about 1.5%. Now, over in the right column, we have the change in the unemployment rate. And as you can see, it rose modestly in the first quarter, but then spiked in the second quarter and started to come down. But note that at the end of the year, the unemployment rate was about 3.25% above its previous year level. And that means that the recovery in the labor market lagged the recovery in the economy overall. In general, employers have been pretty cautious in terms of managing their payrolls. Now, also, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this recovery has been, and the recession that preceded it has been very uneven. So what I'm showing here in this chart is various sectors. This is based on the employment report. This is through November. We'll on Friday be getting the December labor report, and this could be updated as of Friday. But you can see that in the private sector, if you go from February, which was the peak in employment, through November, there was about a 6.5% contraction in employment. But if we take a look at the goods producing sector, so that's manufacturing, construction, and a few other things that produce tangible goods, the contraction was milder in those sectors than in the economy overall. And if we go down a ways and we look at some of the service components, so air transportation down almost a quarter. So that means by November, still about a quarter of employees employed by the airline sector were unemployed. They were not working. And if you look at arts and entertainment, it was an even larger share of that portion of the labor force. And when you look at accommodations, hotels, motels, and so forth, down almost a third from February to November. You take a look at food and drinking, we know the stories abound regarding restaurants that are really struggling to stay alive, and they've been very creative. They've really beefed up their takeout orders, their deliveries of food. And when it comes to opening up the restaurants, they've engaged in creative social distancing, all to try to survive and continue to serve the public. I would point out in the middle, you can see warehousing and storage. Now you notice that that employment in that sector went up 8%. And a lot of that has to do with the way in which we shifted our spending patterns. And if you want to get some idea of how rapidly this changed, this chart here shows e-commerce retail sales relative to total retail sales. And you can see that before the pandemic, this kind of cream colored shaded area here in this chart indicates the current recession. The gray shaded areas in earlier periods represent previous recessions. So we're in a recession. When we come out has yet to be determined. But you can see that there was a spike in e-commerce sales as a share of total sales. And that's, I don't think, comes as a surprise to anybody. I'm sure that all of us have stepped up our purchases from Amazon and other e-commerce distributors and have stayed away from store purchases to an important extent. And another thing that's worth noting is that when spending started to pick up fairly early on in the spring, spending was outstripping production. So inventories dropped. So this is the inventory sales ratio in the retail sector. And you can see that it's much below norms. And that includes not only toilet paper and paper towels, but it includes a lot of other retail goods as well. And as I'm going to point out in a few moments, this bodes fairly well for the near term in terms of production of goods. And another feature of the recovery that we've experienced to date is that when it comes to consumer spending, spending on big ticket items has been pretty strong. So if we take a look here, this is through the year 2020 through November, the most recent or the latest data we have. You can see that this in February, spending on big ticket items like other things dropped off sharply, but it recovered very sharply. And by June, spending on big ticket items surpassed the earlier pre-pandemic levels and continued to grow. So usually I think that's a fairly good sign in terms of the attitude of consumers, that you usually don't go out and spend a lot of money on a new car or a refrigerator or a television set unless you're pretty secure that you are certain you're not going to need those funds, and that if you borrowed to buy the item, that you're going to have enough income coming in to be able to service that loan. So I think that's a healthy sign. Now, clearly, and we'll be talking about this a little bit, not everybody is sharing in this recovery. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. And if we take a look at housing, the housing sector, and I'm showing here new home sales dropped off sharply in the late winter and early spring, but then they rebounded and have been running well above what they were running before the pandemic. So that, again, is an indicator that people are willing to step out and make commitments. And this is, I'm showing here new home purchases, but in the secondary market, that is existing home sales, they've been pretty much matching this here. So the residential sector is pretty robust these days. Now, as part of this surge in demand, we're seeing that home prices are accelerating. This is showing through in part to a bit of a surge in terms of home prices. This is a 12-month % change in home prices, and you can see that it's up above 8% in the most recent period. And one of the things that is providing a boost, particularly to the housing sector, but also spending on big ticket items, is interest rates and financing availability. It's very, very favorable. You see that interest rates, this is the 10-year benchmark treasury yield, the one that most people in the marketplace look at. And you can see that going into the pandemic, rates were very, very low by historical standards. And then they plunged, and they've recovered a little bit since that time, but not a whole lot. And I'll be giving reasons for that in a few moments. And these low rates are not only boosting real estate markets, but they're also boosting the stock market. And if we're looking at the condition of households and really their ability to continue spending, one of the things that is encouraging is the saving rate here. So this is saving out of disposable personal income. And it spiked back in April. People have just really cut back sharply on their spending. And the saving rate spiked, and it's come down since that time, but it's still high by historical standards. So from the standpoint of whether consumers can continue to increase their spending more rapidly than their income, this says that they can. And going on and taking a look at their wealth position. So now this is household wealth in relation to disposable personal income. The two principal components are equity wealth, that is stock market wealth, either directly held stock or indirectly through pension plans, and also equity in homes. So this dropped off pretty sharply in the second quarter of last year, and then bounced back pretty sharply in the third quarter. This does not go through the end of the year, but when we get the data, it's going to show that there was another big increase in wealth in relationship to disposable income. So wealth positions are very favorable too. So on balance, when we look at the household sector overall, the household sector is well positioned to be spending going forward. Now, another thing that doesn't get as much attention as I think it should, these are what we call continuing claims. This represents the total number of people who are collecting unemployment insurance. And so, I mean, clearly that spiked back in the spring, and that has been on a fairly steady downturn, downward trend since that time. But in recent weeks, the slope is much shallower, so the decline has slowed. But the encouraging thing from this is that the number of people who are coming off the unemployed rolls is exceeding, or has been exceeding, the number of people being added on. Every Thursday morning, and tomorrow morning will not be an exception, we'll be hearing about the number of people who have filed for unemployment insurance. And it'll be, by historical standards, a big number. But at least until very recently, the number of people coming off has actually exceeded the number of people applying. And I think that's worth keeping in mind. It gives you a little sense that, there still is some forward momentum in the economy and in the labor market. So speaking of momentum, the fundamentals, as I see them, suggest that the economy is going to continue to move forward. I think in light of the outbursts of COVID that we've been dealing with over the last couple of months, that is contributing to certain choppiness in terms of this forward momentum, and that's going to be the case for the next several months. Now, as I mentioned, lean inventories are really a very favorable factor in terms of the near-term outlook, because what's happening is retailers are boosting their orders to be able to restock their shelves. And that's going to be translated and is being translated in terms of production schedules. So that means there's going to be more production, and we're going to need more employees to produce those goods to be able to restock those shelves. And then my guess is probably no better than anybody else's in terms of just when we're going to have COVID under control. But given the availability of the vaccine and other factors that are going on, and particularly once we get into the warmer weather and people are outside more and there's less vulnerability, and just given what we've learned thus far about the spread of COVID, that my guess is that sometime around mid-year, we're going to see that things are starting to improve on that front. And that's going to be a very important plus as far as the economy goes. So I think right now I'm looking at the second half of next year as looking pretty good. What's going to be behind this? Well, I've already talked about the comfortable wealth position. The high saving rate is enabling consumers to step out and spend more. Favorable financing conditions for most. But, as I point out in this last bullet point, not all consumers and also small businesses are going to be participating in this. There are still quite a few people who are really struggling and have been struggling for a number of months. And so they're not in a position where they're going to be upping their spending anytime soon. When it comes to businesses, if you look at this chart here, this is an index of business uncertainty, and this would be uncertainty regarding sales growth. And you can see that this shot up early in the recession, but it's been coming down fairly steadily. And so businesses, if we go back and look at the second quarter, businesses really did everything they did to increase their cash positions. They slashed their spending patterns. They cut their payrolls. They did all kinds of things to be prepared for this very, very uncertain future in the COVID era. And as things have become clear, uncertainty has diminished, this has given them the incentive to undertake some pent-up projects. And so as this uncertainty is receding and continues to recede, this is going to be a positive factor in terms of business spending, business investment spending. Another factor, and our area is linked to a degree to exports, the dollar, which as is often the case, very commonly the case, and when you have a global event like this, the dollar is a safe haven and the dollar will tend to spike. So that happened last spring, and it's been declining on balance over this period. But note that in recent months, the dollar has gone below pre-COVID levels. And so that's going to be a plus as far as export demand. So that's going to be adding to this upward momentum that will be building over the next year. One other thing that I look at is oil prices. And this is the benchmark West Texas Intermediate. And of course, early in the COVID period, oil prices collapsed. In fact, there were a couple of days when they were actually negative. But they've been recovering, and more recently they've been recovering. Now, I don't have the last couple of days on this chart, and I don't think it would be terribly helpful to show them. There was a big increase because OPEC got together a couple of days ago and agreed to constrict supply. I view this more as an indicator of demand, both current and very imminent demand. And when global demand is increasing, the demand for oil is increasing, and that puts upward pressure on prices. So I view this rise that we've had over the last couple of months in oil prices as indicating that the global economy is starting to get some traction. Now, I wanted to make the point that forecasters, for the most part, have been more pessimistic about the recovery. And I'm singling out the Fed Reserve here. They go through this exercise. They usually do it 4 times a year, but because of COVID, things were kind of interrupted for a while. But here's what they published about a year ago after their meeting in December of 2019. They were forecasting, this is pre-COVID, they were forecasting 2% growth in the year 2020. Now, all of these are forecasts for the year 2020. But when they, in June, when they redid their forecast, they were projecting growth in 2020 to be minus 6.5%. That is a 6.5% contraction in the economy. Now, when they redid their projections 3 months later in September, they took that down almost in half. And then most recently, when they revisited the projections for the year 2020, they saw a decline of about 2.5. And I think it's quite possible that when all is said and done, the decline will be even smaller than that. So I make that point because forecasters, and the Fed is not the only one, other forecasters, the IMF, various private forecasters, for the most part, have not been terribly sanguine in terms of their assessment of the prospects for the economy recovering. And I think to an important extent, they're affected by the headlines. And so the news media has made a big deal out of the spread of COVID. And I think there's been a tendency on the part of forecasters to let that drive their forecast rather than kind of a more fundamental assessment of what's going on here. So the service sector, which is for which smaller businesses are very highly concentrated, this has been the hard, as we noted from a slide earlier on, has been the hardest hit component of the economy. And as things are improving, then we're going to see improvement in the service sector. And I think by mid-year, it's going to be clear that growth in the service sector is going to exceed that of the rest of the economy. But because they're starting out further behind, they're not going to catch up over 2021 to the rest of the economy. So as I mentioned, the service sector is disproportionately small businesses. And one of the things that I would also point out in this regard is when we look at stock indexes like the S&P 500 or the Dow Jones, there aren't small businesses in those indexes. So the firms that get represented in those indexes are, to a very important extent, the firms that have prospered during this the rebound in the economy. Now, one sector that I'm going to single out here is one that's going to be struggling for a good bit of time is commercial real estate, particularly office space and retail space. We have found a shift to teleworking, and the stories are growing in terms of many firms have discovered that they can get by very well by having their employees work from home, and they're not going to be needing as much office space going forward. And the same has been true with regards to e-commerce. So I think we're going to see more vacancies. We're going to see some real weakness in terms of rents, leasing prices for commercial space. And one other little sidebar here is we've been in a period since last March, a period of forbearance regarding loans. And so the authorities have encouraged banks to practice forbearance with their customers and basically not to regard loans that are delinquent as being delinquent. And so under the surface and to some unknown extent, there are a lot of loan losses. And so we're going to be learning more about this in the quarters ahead. Not too long, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to start getting earnings reports for commercial banks. And it'll be interesting to see what they have to say about what they see the near future to be in terms of credit losses and what kind of provisioning they're going to be having to do to be able to cover those losses. Now, Frank said that he wanted to talk about government policy. Obviously, we've got a new administration coming in 2 weeks. And the president-elect has said that he wants to step up spending. And he's got a long laundry list of programs that he wants to spend more on. He's also indicated that he wants to raise taxes, and he's been specific about the corporate tax rate, the capital gains tax, personal tax rates, particularly on upper income folks, the inheritance tax. So here we've got, in terms of fiscal policy, we've got kind of things going in opposite directions, more spending, but also higher taxes, which will be a restraining factor on the economy. And so when I put in this third bullet, I was thinking that there was a good chance that we're still going to have a divided government. And by the way, markets love gridlock. If you have at least one of the three components here, one of the legislative chambers or the White House that's different from the other party, that this usually means gridlock. And so they see this as a positive thing, that not much damage can be done in that regard. But in light of what seems to be the outcome in Georgia, based on the results from yesterday's election, it seems like some of that resistance is not going to be as great as it otherwise would have been. And the administration also has been very clear that it will be reimposing many of the regulations that the Trump administration relaxed. So these are factors that are going to be affecting, some in a positive way and others in a negative way, the national economy. But when it comes to monetary policy or Fed policy, the Fed's policy is going to be very clearly very expansionary. Over the past year, we had a fiscal deficit of 3.3 trillion, trillion with a T. And the Fed in the secondary market, not in terms of direct purchases, but in terms of purchasing Treasury securities in the secondary market, the Fed bought about 2/3, the equivalent to 2/3 of that deficit. So in a sense, indirectly, the Fed has been doing a lot of financing of government deficits. And the Fed has indicated in terms of its current plans that its purchases over the year 2021 will roughly match the size of the deficit, at least the current projected size of the deficit. So the Fed is doing an awful lot to absorb the debt that results from these big deficits. And further, the Fed has indicated that it's going to be holding the federal funds rate, that's the interest rate that it controls, at its what it calls its effective lower bound, which is 0 to 25 basis points for quite some time. It's indicated that it wants average inflation to be 2%. And what I've illustrated in this chart is this red line here is 2% inflation. As you can see, for most of the period since the Great Recession, about a dozen years ago, inflation has been running below 2%. So average inflation has been below 2%. And the Fed is now saying they want average inflation to be 2%, which means that inflation is going to have to be running above 2% for a while for that average to turn out to be 2%. And so the Fed has said that they're not going to be raising their target for the federal funds rate until the unemployment rate or the labor market that achieves essentially maximum employment, or the unemployment rate is about 4%, in the vicinity of 4%. It was 6.7% in November, so there's a lot of room to be made up here to get down to 4%, and inflation is going to have to be 2%. And the trajectory for inflation is going to have to be upwards before they'll consider raising the target for the federal funds rate. So these days, people in the marketplace have pretty much built in the notion that interest rates are going to remain low for quite some time. What I've shown here is it's the 1-year forward interest rate. This is derived from the yield curve. It's basically what people in the marketplace are predicting the 1-year Treasury rate will be 5 years into the future. And you can see it dropped very, very sharply at the onset of the COVID shock, and it stayed low. It's edged up a little bit, but it's still very, very low. It's under 1%. The current 1-year rate for a 1-year Treasury bill is about 12 basis points. So it's got they're saying that it's going to go up a little bit between now and 5 years from now, but they're expecting that rates are going to remain low for quite some time, that we're in this ultra low interest rate era and are going to stay there for some time. So that's going to be providing an awful lot of stimulus to the economy going forward. So this ends my presentation. I would just point out that I do have a website here if anybody would like to check it out, and I post commentaries on the economy on that website.
Thank you, Dr. Simpson. I do have one question. Obviously, we've seen 2 rounds of COVID relief passed and disseminated. It's my assumption that a good chunk of that was paid for through debt spending.
Yes.
How do you think that's going to impact the economy long term? Obviously, there's a short-term boost, but is there going to be a long-term hangover? And how would you weigh in on that?
Right. Well, your point is very well taken. I mean, when you take a look at what we did last year, we added basically $3.3 trillion to our total debt. And now we're going to be, through this new bill, we're going to be adding several hundred million more in the coming year to an already very large deficit. So, I mean, we're piling on the debt. And we can't, this is unsustainable. We can't go on forever like this. At some point, the chickens are going to come home to roost. And when interest rates start going up, we're going to see a big pinch in terms of the federal budget. And it's going to impose some fiscal restraint. It's going to require some fiscal restraint. That is, we're going to have to start squeezing out other programs in order to be able to afford the interest payments once interest rates start rising and rising fairly steadily. So at some point, we're going to have to pay the piper. You know, I think one could take a look at Greece and what Greece went through about 8 or 9 years ago as kind of a bellwether for what we can expect here. At some point, investors are going to go on strike and they're going to say, no, you're going to have to pay up. That is the US government, if you want our funds, because we think default risk now is a real possibility and we want to be compensated for that. And then, you know, when you start to get into that can be a pretty vicious situation. And it's undoubtedly going to require very substantial fiscal restraint. And it's going to be a very unpleasant period. Hopefully we can focus a little more on this. And once we get this pandemic behind us, start preparing for the future so that our budget is going to be more affordable, and that we're not going to have to impose these draconian restraints on the economy through fiscal policy.
That would be nice, but I'm not going to hold my breath on Washington doing that.
I think you're very wise.
With that, we'll thank you for your comments. We'll certainly have questions later. We'll turn it over to Dr. Jones for an update on our local economy.
Can I pile on to the pessimism for a second?
Sure, why not?
So one way of looking at the way the federal government's going to eventually deal with this debt is through a political lens. And if you assume that congressmen and senators want to get reelected, then they don't want to cut spending in areas that will be tied to them politically, which means the entitlements are going to be really hard to cut. But the spots that it'll be easier for them to politically cut will be the intergovernmental transfers that eventually filter down to the state and local governments, which means some of this is going to end up being funded through probably tax increases at the local level. To Commissioner Williams, this is eventually probably going to end up in your lap.
And I'm going to weigh in on that before you share your screen. The government at state and federal levels has a notorious habit for eliminating the funding for something, but still requiring us to do it. And then they brag about their tax cut when all they did was pass the buck to somebody else. And, you know, as the Association of County Commissioners, our position is that if the state or federal government mandates that we do something, they should provide the funding for it. And here in North Carolina, we also have very limited flexibility on how we can generate funding. We can't generate revenue at the county level except in ways that are explicitly allowed by the state government, which is pretty much property taxes and sales taxes and some level of fees. So we don't have the flexibility to do a lot of other things beyond that, unfortunately. And you know, if your property taxes are forced to go up because of an unfunded mandate, I will give you the number, some 202 area code numbers to call and complain about it. With that, if you want to share your screen, and let's maybe be a little more optimistic and talk about southeastern North Carolina.
Sounds good. So as I'm looking forward and thinking about what southeastern North Carolina might look like, specifically Brunswick County, I tend to think that we're going to follow the national economy, but with some differences. So as we know, Brunswick County tends to be fairly seasonal. So I think we've still got a couple of really rough months in front of us, but potentially a good summer. Fingers crossed. There's a lot of ifs and buts and maybes in this, but I'm still going to take the optimistic approach. So for the local economy, tend to think national economy, right? It's going to drive most of this, but with some differences. So in the past, southeastern North Carolina has been hit with shocks that have not hit the rest of the country. So a quick example of that is just a hurricane, right? Hurricanes come through, they disrupt activity, we all shut down, and then a month or two later, it's all in the rearview mirror for the most part. This one's a little bit different because it hit the entire country. So the question is, what kind of position are the folks in inland who travel down here and leave their dollars in southeastern Carolina? And that's where I'm fairly optimistic. Dr. Simpson talked about the high savings rate earlier. I think that puts us in a strong position as long as we can get to the summertime. So a little bit of context. If we're thinking about the local economy as being similar to the national economy but different, how are we different? So if we look at industry employment by sector and we take the local employment share and just divide by the national employment share, we can see which industries are the strongest in our region. So one, then, if you're looking at local share versus national share, if they're the same, then that ratio is 1. So 1 is the national average. So anything greater than 1 is going to be an industry that is overrepresented in our region. And two of them that show up real quickly when we look at the chart are construction and leisure and hospitality. So I've showed it for both Brunswick County and New Hanover County. The reason for showing both of them is we're going to have to do a little bit of jumping back and forth with some numbers, because the county level data often comes out with a significant lag compared to some of the metropolitan area data. So we're going to take some trends that are happening in the Wilmington metropolitan area, and we're going to extrapolate from those over the Brunswick County. All right, so what happened with these sectors at a local level? So Dr. Simpson talked about this being a very uneven pandemic, very different effects. So I've graphed most of the major industries from the region. You always wonder how much to trust some of these statistics. There's a major one that's missing off of here, which is manufacturing, because if you look at the BLS data, it suggests that manufacturing is up nearly 20% since the start of the pandemic. It's down everywhere else, every other metropolitan area. So I went, I think there's a quirk in those statistics somewhere. Emailed the BLS, they said, oh, we'll look into it and get back to you, and never did. So there's probably just something wrong. So it's not showing on here. But I think that the obvious ones to look at are going to be the two industries that are really strong in this area, right? Construction and leisure and hospitality. So construction is that bold purple line, and you can see that it's held up pretty well. Employment in leisure and hospitality has taken the largest hit though. So that's one of the major areas of employment in the region, and it's the one that took it on the chin. We've seen some recovery. Brunswick County has actually held up better than a lot of places on the occupancy side, but it's still suffering as well in terms of restaurant employment and a lot of these leisure activities. So with that in mind, the two areas, one of them held up, one of them really took a big hit. So what we're looking for as we approach the summer is that going to recover? All right, so thinking about Brunswick County versus North Carolina and the US, leisure and hospitality, big industry, the one that took the hardest hit of the industries, means that the unemployment rate in Brunswick County rose more than the state and national average. So Brunswick County's unemployment rate tends to run a little bit higher than those averages anyway. Being one of the fastest growing counties in the nation, it's just hard to absorb that many people that quickly. So y'all have done an admirable job of keeping up with it, but this disruption was definitely worse for y'all than it was for other places around the state and around the US. But nevertheless, it's come back down more in line with state and national averages as we've reopened and as we've kind of learned how to live with the virus. And this shows up, you can see looking at the occupancy tax receipts, you can see that big dip when we went into the shutdown, but you can also see a recovery following it. This chart is one of the reasons I'm kind of optimistic about the summer, is you can see even with the pandemic, that occupancy tax receipts rose above prior levels, which suggests to me that as soon as we started to reopen, people said, I'm tired of being in this home bedroom, office / playroom, everything all in one spot. Let's go to someplace that's fun. And they headed to vacation rentals down at the beach. So a little optimistic about the future, but with a whole lot of caveats. So I need to be real open and honest and say, look, I am not an epidemiologist. I am not a political scientist. I am not a psychologist, but all of that plays a part of how we think about what might happen here this summer. So I'm not an epidemiologist, but if I look at the cases and what's going on in North Carolina right now, I have a hard time imagining those numbers significantly subsiding in the next couple of weeks. Right? It may flatten off, it may come down, but it's going to take more than a couple of weeks for us to get there. We're probably talking months. And serious relaxation of the governor's restrictions probably won't happen until after those numbers have come down and stayed down for a little while. I know he's eager to reopen for political reasons, but there's a balance between health, public health, cautiousness, and that political motivation. So it's probably going to be a little bit more of a lag in there after the cases start to come down, before we see restrictions on restaurants go away, et cetera. And even when that happens, it's not just the restrictions from the governor that matter. It's also where are consumers, where is their psychology, and how comfortable are they? So I have an awful lot of friends that have not put a foot in a restaurant since this thing started. They say, look, I'm just not comfortable being indoors. So even once we open up, we've got to get people over that to the point where they're comfortable going back to indoor entertainment, eating, concerts, et cetera. And that probably means we're waiting on the vaccines. So I think there's reason for hope, and that's that the vaccines are coming. Better weather should help this in a few months when we get there, but we've got some time here before we get to that point. So what is this probably going to look like? Well, Dr. Simpson talked about those high levels of savings earlier. And this is one of the things that really at least caught me off guard when the pandemic started. And that's that I expected folks to see their income drop in March and April as we shut everything down. But these massive stimulus checks actually pushed income up by a record level. So we've got this weird situation where we couldn't go out. We couldn't go spend. Folks were nervous about spending, but there was more income coming in the door. So what that means is that cash was piling up and savings levels hit a record rate, nearly 30% for a while. Yes, it's come down, but it's still about double what it usually is. Folks are saving. So what are they doing with those extra savings? Some of it's going into the stock market, but a fair amount of it is sitting in folks' bank accounts, in their checking accounts. So I don't know about you, but my wife doesn't trust me with much cash, because if it's in my pocket, I'm going to spend it, right? So if we look at household and nonprofit checkable deposits, these get lumped together. We can't just look at what households have. But if we look at their checkable deposits, they're sitting on large cash reserves. So not only is their wealth position strong, but they also have a strong liquidity position where they can easily turn this cash into a trip to the beach, restaurants, entertainment, concerts, once things start to reopen and they get comfortable again. So if we go back to looking at our income versus expenditures, let's focus on the expenditures for just a second. So expenditures right now are still below pre-pandemic levels, but that masks the differences within our expenditures. So if we take expenditures and we decompose them, we can look at what people are spending money on. And we see that spending on durable goods, the blue line, is above pre-pandemic levels. So this is us going out and buying our big ticket items, right? That stimulus check arrives and you say, maybe it's time to replace that washing machine that's banging and rattling around, or buying new cars. So these big ticket items we've been purchasing. We're starting to see that slow down a little bit, but still considerable amounts of spending on it. The more what I would call daily purchases, the non-durable items, is the red line. And I don't know if this is cool to anybody else other than an economist, but you see that little spike at the start of the pandemic, and that's us all going out and hoarding goods, right? We got to all buy toilet paper and stock the refrigerators and all that stuff we thought we were going to need, right? That's that spike. And then the world closed and we quit going out and buying anything. But over time, as we've sort of learned how to live with this, we've seen those purchases go back closer to normal. But the one that's really important for us here in southeastern North Carolina is the blue line, and that's expenditures on services. And that has yet to recover, right? This is going out to eat at restaurants. This is going to concerts. This is a large part of what we do in this part of the state. And that's the area that's lagging, right? Spending on fun hasn't been happening. Lots of stuff from Amazon, not much in-person experiences. So what might change that? Well, I think the story is one that we've heard an awful lot about, and that's these vaccines. So the question is, how quickly are these vaccines going to get rolled out? And I'm not sure I trust anybody's forecast. I'm certainly not putting out a forecast of how quickly the vaccines are going to be rolled out. But if we need to have one just to kind of think about this, let's look at Goldman Sachs' forecast. So Goldman Sachs thinks that somewhere around half the population in the US is going to be vaccinated by sort of early to mid-spring, around April-ish. So what's, I think, encouraging about that is that's before the summer tourism season hits down here in southeastern North Carolina. So just for fun, if we lay the occupancy tax graph over the top of Goldman Sachs vaccine rollout graph, you see the vaccines roll out and kind of plateau before the tourism season hits. So what we're really kind of relying on here is that this vaccine rollout goes smoothly and quickly. And there have been some hiccups at the start. So we need to hope that that picks up just a little bit in order to save that prime season that's so important to us here. So will the tourists come back? So obviously our fingers are crossed for vaccines, but I would point out that if you sort of separate the lodging from the entertainment, we're probably still going to see a bunch of folks come down here for lodging no matter what happens. So people are already starting to get back out and go about their lives again, right? Mobility levels are still down from where they were pre-pandemic, but they're way up off of their April bottom. Air travel is still down, but if people are getting out and they're not willing to fly, that means they're going to be looking for places to go that they can drive to, and that tends to be southeastern North Carolina. So here's a cool way of looking at it. This is cell phone mobility data from the Dallas Federal Reserve. This is Brunswick County, New Hanover, and Pender. And you can see where the shutdown happened, the recovery as we started to get back out again, and that we haven't quite reached pre-pandemic levels yet. And if we throw in the major cities, Charlotte and Raleigh, so Mecklenburg and Wake counties, we see that their mobility levels are a little bit lower than ours here. So why are theirs lower? Well, there are two options. Either the cities are taking social distancing more seriously, or there's some difference in the way we go about our daily lives, right? Employment opportunities, shopping, etc. So if we take this data, which was weekly data before, and we look at it in daily terms, we see an awful lot more noise in there. And what is all that noise? This is a weekly pattern where people are going out on the weekends and they're working from home. So what's keeping mobility rates down in the cities is the different types of work there. You've got an awful lot of business and professional services that can be done remotely, and those folks are staying home. But when we throw them in there on the weekly data, folks in the cities are going out on the weekends, just like we are down here. And what that tells me is if they're willing to go out on the weekends, but they're working from home because they can work from home, that means they're going to be willing to come down here come this summer. They may not go out to eat, but they're still going to come to the beach. So what are our takeaways? We've got a cold winter in front of us with a few ugly months still, but as the vaccines roll out, as the weather improves, we should start to see a pickup and maybe have a really good summer in southeastern North Carolina. The vaccines could deploy just in time, hopefully. There's pent-up demand for experiences, services, and getting out. Consumers are sitting on cash to fund those experiences, and these drive-in markets are poised for a strong summer. So this is all contingent on vaccines and consumer confidence, but there's a possibility we could have a record summer down here. Fingers crossed. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. And just one question I have, obviously the residential real estate sales numbers in Brunswick and New Hanover County have been absolutely through the roof. Brunswick County's had several months that were 80 and 90% higher than the same month last year. And I remember 2 or 3 years ago, they were excited to pass $1 billion in sales and then pass $2 billion last year in 2020. And then Jim Goodman, who's a former BCAR president, is on this call and posted that lodging is above last year. His agency saw record rental numbers this year. So I guess, how does the residential sales component play into future economic trends here? And a related question to that, I've got a friend who technically works in Washington, D.C., but to the fact that she can work from home now, she lives in Charleston, South Carolina, and still works in Washington, but doesn't have to live there anymore. And how do you think that that may play into a migration out of the cities to places like Brunswick County?
There are a couple pieces there. Let me start first with just what's going on in the real estate markets that is really interesting. Is you've got this expansion of demand. At the same time, you have a contraction of supply. So if you look at the new number of listings, there are a lot of folks who don't want anybody else in their house. So they've decided we're just going to hold off. And that's when demand increases, supply decreases, you see prices go up. So we've seen home prices rise a significant amount. As for the longer run implications of this, your guess is as good as mine. I tend to think that we're going to see a couple years of folks being able to work remotely or these vacancies in office space. And then we're going to trend back towards the way we were before. So it's one thing to make sales calls versus going to visit your customers when everybody is making the Zoom call. But when your competitor shows up at your customer's door and knocks on it, now you've got some strong competition. So folks are going to get pushed back onto the road again. I think lots of companies are going to realize their employees are productive at home for a short period of time until those informal relationships and conversations that take place start to fade away, and then they'll start wanting to bring folks back in. So I think we've got a couple of years of folks moving to the region, and the question is, as they start getting those calls to go back again, can they find other employment here, or do they start their own businesses? And we see an entrepreneurship wave that follows this. Frank, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm muted. Going back to something that Dr. Simpson said about commercial real estate, I've got a friend who owns a communication agency in Raleigh that when all of this started and they put people working at home, they realized it worked so well that they sold half of their office space and had it on the, interestingly, they had it on the market and sold it within a week, which was surprising how quickly it sold. But they just decided that they had some people who could work just as effectively from home and come in on a limited basis. So I think that's a prime example of what you said earlier. See, somebody posted a comment, a question. Let's see who. From Steve Beecroft. In regard to housing sales, what percentage of these sales are second homes compared to permanent residency? And I don't know that either one of y'all would have information on that, but it's
yeah, I can't tell you right now. When the Census Bureau catches up a couple of years from now, then we'll be able to tell you.
Yeah,
Jim, if you're on the call and want to if you have any insight into that you want to share in the chat window, I'll relay it now.
I would confirm what Adam said. I mean, I'm not picking up stories that a lot of people are going out and buying second homes. I think that we might go through kind of a mini early 2000s period if we continue to get the kind of appreciation in home prices that, and with generally investment yields so low in this environment that some people may be taking on some risk here in terms of buying not just second homes, but rental properties to try to get better returns. So, we might be experiencing a little bit of that. But I'm not sure in these circumstances that there's been a whole lot of that activity that has unfolded yet, but I think the prospects are certainly quite possible for that.
You mentioned people buying rental properties. Do you think that the current moratorium on evictions might make people hesitant to become landlords if they're not already?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it certainly goes in that direction. Yeah, but then on the other hand, if financing costs are so low, and if you think that you're going to get some appreciation, that'll tend to work against it.
Dr. Jones, were you getting ready to make a comment when
I was going to say that some of this could also be, you have millennials that were a little slower to start families and move towards the suburbs. And there was this discussion that single family housing was ending and everybody was moving to the downtowns. I think this has pushed some of them to move towards single family housing, and it was sort of delayed and it needed a trigger to push them. And I think this could be it.
And Jim Goodman just posted, he said that at the beach, which is where he focuses, that rentals are up and appreciation is up. And obviously the beach may not be an apples to apples comparison to, say, Cary or Raleigh or even Wilmington. But if anyone else has any questions, we have time for maybe one more before we adjourn. And one question I had is, obviously this COVID has changed some things that'll be temporary and some that will be permanent. What do you think the long-term, either one of you, implications will be in terms of sectors that will benefit permanently from this and sectors that may be permanently harmed?
Well, I think that the creative sectors are going to benefit from it because it's easier to collaborate across space now that we all know how to use Zoom or whatever your product of choice is. And that kind of became clear to me when we were getting ready to reopen the university in the fall. And I was going through the classrooms and I was picking up the help manuals that were sitting on the desks. And they were all about how to log into Zoom and how to schedule a meeting. And I thought, we have come so far from that now the manuals are about how to run breakout sessions. Exactly. So I think that our access to knowledge is going to increase because now we'll be able to run professional development programs that can be sort of just in time, quicker.
Exactly.
At least in my own life, from a research standpoint, it's much easier to collaborate with colleagues around the country now when we're just sharing a screen or using a document camera that even show notes we're scribbling on a piece of paper than it was a year ago.
To that point, the fact that this book is now one of the best-selling business books out there, and it was not even published a year ago, and I'm reading through it, and it's all about how to adapt your business development strategy to the new virtual world, I think reinforces that. Dr. Simpson, do you have any thoughts?
Well, the sectors that have been hardest hit are like air transportation, as we've already noted, and arts, entertainment. I think once the COVID is under control, I think both are going to come back. Those planes are going to be filled. I mean, they've done a pretty remarkable job in my mind in terms of their current load capacity, but it's been through heavy discounting of fares. But I think as people want to kind of stretch their legs and do more travel and not have to be confined to a car. I think air's going to come back, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if a couple of years from now we're going to be looking at very heavy load capacities in air travel. So I think a lot of these, once COVID gets under control, a lot of these things are going to come back, and they're going to come back pretty quickly. The growth rates are going to be faster, as I mentioned before, than the rest of the economy, even though they'll be lagging in terms of where they are compared to pre-COVID. And I think as you just pointed out, and as Adam mentioned, some things, some kinds of tasks we've learned can be done remotely on an ongoing basis. Some require that people get together, maybe not as often as before. So shared office space, things of that sort that we're going to economize more on the use of space, commercial type space. I think that we're going to find that we've had a pretty sharp increase in online purchases, and it may not stay there, but it's still going to be a lot higher than before, which implies that ordinary retail sales are going to have to wait a while before things come back to where they were before COVID. So I guess, I think overall things are positive, but not in every particular sector. And the one thing we haven't talked about at all, which is affecting this area, is what about some of the big cities in the Northeast where people want to move away. And in many cases, their employers have learned that they can, just like your friend who's now working for somebody in DC, but lives and works out of Charleston. So, I think we're going to be seeing some redistribution of the demand for retail and commercial space. And this area is going to be a beneficiary of that.
Absolutely. Well, do either one of you have any final closing remarks before we adjourn? We're a little after 5, and I usually try to keep these to about an hour, but it's been a good discussion and we went a little over, which is a good thing. Either one of you?
Just point out that you may have heard my dog in the background. She wants me to know that it's time for our daily walk in the neighborhood. And one thing that has really struck me is that when there's a turnover of a house, when a house gets sold, it's interesting to look at the license plate of the new occupants, and I've seen a number of New York and New Jersey license plates on those new home buyers. So, we're seeing it directly.
A comment on that regard, we did a citizen survey for the county a few years ago, and one of the questions was, if you moved to Brunswick County, what attracted you here? And one of the most popular answers was lack of snow. I assumed it would be the beach, but it was specifically lack of snow. I don't have to own a snow shovel. Dr. Jones, any final comments?
I think this has been rough on all of us, but back to a conversation we were having earlier, if we can learn the lessons and pick up some new tricks during this, I think maybe we come out the other side of it better.
And that would be my final comment is, we have to learn from this and adapt. The world will never be what it used to be. Regardless of COVID, the world is constantly changing, and I've seen more change in 20 years than I ever thought I would see in my lifetime. And we have to adapt and maximize what we can and learn what we can and move forward. So thank you both for participating, and it's been a great discussion. This will be archived on my website probably sometime tomorrow. I have to edit out the dead time at the beginning, and certainly appreciate your insights. And hopefully next year we can do this again and talk about how the economy is on the uptick and it's back where we want it to be. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to everyone who tuned in as well. Have a great day.